one of the things I wanted to talk about is I've done work in New South Wales and Sydney, Australia, where sex work is non-criminalized. And that means they can research sex work in a way that it can't be researched here in the United States. And
Right.
I want to talk about that research because what you're describing happens on Jasmin. What you just described,
Mhm.
excellent sex research shows exactly what you have said.
Oh my goodness. Yay. I am
I
so
mean,
excited.
exactly. So you are discovering it through your, data sets or, the
Mhm.
models, what they're reporting or, whatever. But sex research supports exactly what is happening on Jasmine.
Oh my goodness. I am so excited. Okay. I'm really excited for this interview. Thank you for giving us your time.
Yeah, for more than 30 years, I provided individual and group therapy here in San Diego, California, where I live, for men who, of all sexual orientations, um, uh, who identified as cis. I did not have any people on the trans or non-binary spectrum in my work come and identify. That doesn't mean they weren't there, but nobody identified that way in the 30 years I was doing the work. That's how much the world has changed. So for 30 years, I had an alternative way for men to come who were concerned about their sexual behavior without identifying as having a diagnosis of sex addiction or a compulsive sexual behavior disorder. Oftentimes, people who are concerned about their sexual behavior only can get help if they meet a threshold of a diagnosis of a disorder. And most sexual concerns are in the range of problems, not disorders. And so, we have problems in life, and we should be able to come and talk about a problem without creating a label or an identity. So that was my mission. And I did that for 30 years, and I created a model of based on sexual health, that men who are concerned about their sexual behavior really lack a vision for who they are, what their sexual health is, what's their vision of sexual health. So my sense is most men, we don't really care about their sexual health in our culture. We tend to only be interested in men's sexual health until after they've injured themselves or somebody else, or hurt somebody or somebody else. And my mission in life has been to sort of uh, create spaces for men to be interested in their sexual health without waiting until a crisis. And so I did this for 30 years. I retired as a psychotherapist in San Diego in 2019. Now I train and train and consult with therapists around the country on working with sexual health in different contexts, psychotherapy or men who are concerned about their sexual behavior. I also co-authored a book called Treating Out of Control Sexual Behavior, Rethinking Sex Addiction. That was published in 2016. And that has become a kind of an influence in the sex therapy field, where now, in addition to talking about people who maybe have serious problems with sexual behavior, the entire field now has adopted the language of out of control sexual behavior, or OCSB, to describe men who just have a problem or a concern about their sexual behavior without having to identify or label themselves as a sex addict or a porn addict, which I think was being used far too often.
Well, I really love what you're doing and your mission. I feel like you're giving men, it sounds like in particular, is who you,
Yes, I worked solely with men all those years. Yes.
it sounds like you're giving men permission to explore their sexuality and to be sexual, which we all are, um, in ways that society doesn't. And I want to talk to you about that because, well, there's a few things you brought up that I'd like to touch.
Mm-hmm.
First and foremost, you use the term sexual health a lot. And my question to you would be, is it possible for a man or anyone to have sexual health if they aren't even really exploratory about their sexuality?
Well, let me tell you, give you a definition of sexual health. Sexual health is really a new concept on the planet. Until about 50 years ago, sexual health meant two things, literally on the planet. Sexual health meant you did not have an unwanted or unplanned pregnancy, and sexual health meant you did not acquire a sexually transmitted infection. So, sexual health until about 50 years ago was you avoided a negative outcome of sex. It was only 50 years ago that the world decided health is not the absence of a problem. Now, think about that. Health is not the absence of a problem. So health is actually a destination. Health has definitions. Health has you can kind of see what health is rather than, oh, I don't have a disease or a disorder, so I guess that means I'm healthy. That is not health. So for the first time on the planet, definitions of sexual health were made, literally, in the history of humankind. So this is very recent. So sexual health, what I propose and have adapted from definitions of sexual health from the World Health Organization and large respected bodies, is I promote sexual health in three different ways. Sexual health is a balance between the necessary safety of sexual activity and the pleasure. So sexual health is this balance, this artful balance between being safe and pleasurable. And every human being is always navigating this territory anytime they engage in sexual fantasy, sexual activity, sexual, pleasure, whatever it is. We're always trying to figure out how do I have this pleasure and not harm myself or somebody else? I mean, that's basically what we're trying to do. And not everybody does this well every time, and particularly because we don't help people learn how to do this well. So sexual health is this balance of safety and pleasure. I have kind of promoted 6 principles of sexual health that are sort of the ways to operationalize the idea. It's sort of this big idea, balance, safety, and pleasure. But what does that look like? How do I do that? How do I know I'm doing that? So there are 6 principles of sexual health, and I think this is what gets to answering your question. Anybody can have sexual health as a foundation. These are 6 foundations. Think of them as like the foundation of a house. This is what you build everything upon. And there's 6 principles. One is consent. That's the most universal principle of sex on the planet. Sex is always consensual. Non-exploitive. And now I think this is a really important sexual health principle for Jasmin and the world in which you're engaged in. Too many people assume the services you provide must, by definition, be an exploitive encounter. And I really want to talk about that because I think this is a really important misunderstood. We live in a culture that is basically illiterate when it comes to exploitation. And so non-exploitation is a sexual health principle. Honesty, shared values. Now, this is an area where I think the services Jasmin provides often create tension in homes or in people's lives because people aren't necessarily honest about enjoying and being involved in the world that Jasmin provides. Or they may be, even though they enjoy it and find it very meaningful to be there, they may have some values conflicts about engaging in this kind of sexual life of the world and working with models in this way online. So it doesn't mean it's conflict free. There's, most sexual activity has some sort of conflict typically. And in fact, part of the reason the conflict helps in sex is that a little bit of naughtiness helps us get erotically pleased. So, Jasmin may have a little bit of that for some people as well. And then protection from STIs, unplanned pregnancies, and HIV. Well, so the online sex world is a perfect place for that protection. Perfect place for that protection. And that may be a motive for some people to be seeking online experiences because they don't have to worry about those particular consequences of their sexual health and to engage in this activity. And last is pleasure. So those are the 6 principles of sexual health. And so anytime somebody's wondering, how am I doing with my sexual health? I would have them go through those 6 ideas and see how they're doing. Is my sex always consensual? Am I doing okay on the non-exploitive front, or do I'm concerned I'm doing some exploitation? Am I being honest enough about my sexual activity? Are there some concerns I have about my honesty? Are there some values here I haven't quite really thought about? And I'm getting the pleasure that I want and seek.
I love that. I really, really love that. I want to go back to, I was chuckling when you said that our culture is pretty much illiterate when it comes to being, exploitive or not.
Yes.
Can you give us a definition? What is non-exploitive and what is exploitive?
Well, I think I'm going to talk about exploitation as a consciousness. In other words, the difference between consent and exploitation, or non-consent and exploitation. Non-consent is really a forced um, interaction between two people or more, where somebody is exerting coercion and force, threats of violence, threats of bodily harm, endangering somebody, unless they engage in some sort of sexual activity. Threat, homicide threats, threats of all sorts of awful things. So non-consent is a much more egregious and the most, the most violent and the most egregious violation of sexual health on the planet.
I agree.
Then we get into exploitation, which oftentimes these two are confused. One of the most common forms of exploitation, one of the most common ways the term exploitation is not applied is in when people have what we call affairs. In other words, somebody has a relationship agreement between them and a partner, and they decide unilaterally one day to not keep that agreement. And then they're not honest about not keeping that agreement. And here's where the exploitation comes in. They enter their home, they go back to the relationship they were in, and they have the power now. They know they haven't kept that agreement. Information is power. And so they walk into this relationship. They know they've not kept the agreement. They have that information. And what do? They make sure that information is not known. And so they engage in exploitive activities because of the power to convince the person that, no, I've kept the relationship agreement while I was away for the last whatever. And so the exploitation is the ability to use that power of that information to have somebody perceive that you've kept a relationship agreement when you haven't. And many people, these are called affairs or, go out on the relationship, whatever the lingo is. But the primary issue there is that a person used information, that's power, to get what they wanted sexually.
I also want to go back to something that you mentioned earlier about sex addiction. And the fact that that is pretty much, it sounds like you would say it's overly diagnosed.
Well, first of all, it's not a recognized diagnosis anywhere in the organizations who recognize diagnoses or classify diseases. So sex addiction is an idea that is promoted in the mental health field, but it is not a recognized disorder. You can't go into a diagnostic manual and see diagnostic criteria in the psychiatric disorder manual, the Diagnostic and the Statistic Manual, the DSM in the United States. They don't have a category called sex addiction or porn addiction. And the other classification system that's used throughout the world is the International Classification of Disorders. The ICD is what it's called, and the United States doesn't use that for mental health diagnoses, but the rest of the world does. And they have a classification for compulsive sexual behavior disorder, which is very new, but it is not in any way considered relevant or similar to the idea of sex addiction. So the very word is, I'm going to call it like, when you go to buy what I'm going to call facial tissues in the grocery store, and even the sign says facial tissues, but everybody says I need to get Kleenex. That's what sex addiction is. Sex addiction is the Kleenex of sexual behavior concerns. It's a popular word that helps the culture understand what we're talking about, but it's not an accurate description of what's actually going on. Can I give the third part of sexual health that I want the men or the people who are listening to this? I talked about balance between pleasure and safety. I talked about the 6 principles of sexual health, and the third component is keeping agreements about sex. It comes down to those 3 things. And these are the things most people run into dilemmas with. And notice my language is just describing what happens without using the language society calls it. Cheater, really mean words. Sex addict, porn addict. These are all terms that give an opinion and an evaluation of the person, and usually is very shaming. I'm interested in language that just describes what's happening. Oh, you didn't balance your safety and pleasure very well. Oh, you crossed some of the sexual health principles. Oh, you broke a relationship agreement. We're just describing what happened without assigning a value, an opinion, or a pejorative disgust or disdain for it.
I really appreciate that. I really do. And I think that can be applied to many other areas of life where we can just describe the action and not label someone a nasty label that we know has a negative connotation or whatever the case is.
And we have to humanize people. Everybody fails at keeping their agreements.
Yeah.
It's called being human.
I have found in most of the members I've interviewed, and this has certainly come up with the Kinsey Institute's research as well, many of the members that are on LiveJasmin, there is a gap in their connection needs being met.
Mm-hmm.
And that is actually one of the main driving forces for them being there. So my question for you would be, how related is our connection needs and our intimacy needs? Are they one and the same?
I want to deconstruct your question in a couple of ways. I was taught a study abroad program on human sexuality for Masters of Counseling students in just two universities of Texas. They would take all the students out of Texas, Masters students, and throw them in Australia and do an immersive week-long human sexuality course to get them out of their restrictive environment to be more open-minded to learn about sexuality. It worked beautifully, and my husband and I were the faculty. We taught the course. And one of the people I met through the course of teaching this course is actually a sex researcher in Australia. Now, why is this important? Because he was a sex researcher in New South Wales, which is the state in which Sydney's located. In that state, sex work is decriminalized. So in New South Wales, there are 3 levels of sex work. There are what they call high-end sex workers, who charge enormous amount of money, and people that are very wealthy can use them. And that's one way of starting out in sex work, very high-end work. And then they have what are called a legal status in New South Wales called brothels, where a person can, in their own home, conduct the business of transactional sex legally. They just have permits and they go get health things, and it's all very up and up. And then the lowest level is street work, where people are actually involved in transactional sex through negotiating it, in public spaces. Here's a thing: the researcher's named Dr. Philip Birch. One thing he found about sex work: it's the only profession that where you start is the top level you're ever going to get. They found people didn't move up into those other levels of sex work; they only moved down. So if you were a high-end sex worker, that you didn't, and started there, you could go to brothel work, and but if you started at street level, you never went up to brothel work. This was very interesting research, even though it was legal. I thought that was really an interesting and piece of research he found. But here's the thing that's relevant to your question. He found that he interviewed sex workers and customers, providers and purchasers is what he called them, providers and purchasers. And they found there was a huge percentage of providers and purchasers who very soon into the sexual transaction, the sexual component waned more and more and more. And what was really the emphasis of these interactions was interpersonal connection. What Dr. Birch called this was the dating experience, that people were really interested in having a dating experience, not as genital-focused orgasms. Now, that may have been part of the experience, but more and more that became less and less the focus of the interaction. And this was a stereotype. This was a data. This is an outcome of his data, that all the stereotypes of these kinds of sexual interactions, nobody assumed were true. Everybody assumed, first of all, it was very exploitive, and that these, sex workers were being taken advantage of. There was no consideration of agency and efficacy of somebody engaging in this activity that actually may enjoy it. This isn't a meaningful part of their life. And what the sex workers talked most about was how meaningful it was for them to provide these interpersonal dating experiences for the purchasers that they interacted with. That this was meaningful work. And, there's so much judgment out there that says this work cannot be meaningful. It can only be exploitive. And that's a stereotype that we need more and more research. Now, what happens, which is important in New South Wales, because it's decriminalized, we can research the activity, and people can come forward who are purchasing these activities without concern about consequences for engaging in illegal activity. So this is the dilemma for good research in our country here in the United States, is that it's very difficult to get good research because there's the tension around this being a form of commerce that's not legal, except in Nevada.
I had one model tell me just last week that she has a member who is in with her for 5 hours, just like they're washing the dishes, they're having coffee, he's doing his work, but he just wants someone on the computer with him. He wants someone there with him. It makes him feel like he's not alone. And she's just there. He has her in a private. He pays for 5 hours. I've had other models tell me that they watched a movie with a member. They just watched the same movie and they were on the call for 10 hours. Nothing sexual happened. A lot of these members are genuinely, the research is showing, seeking connection more.
I want to describe a little differently. You're describing the creative solutions people use when they feel lonely, when they feel alone, when they're lacking a level of connection and companionship, when they're really seeking and wanting that.
Yeah.
And I really, the economics of this is interesting because some men, may go into debt and get in large credit card debt. I mean, these are real problems. But I want to emphasize that you're describing people who are looking for a very human need.
Yeah.
And we live in a culture of sexism and masculinity that for men to say, I feel kind of alone, or I feel lonely, or I really miss companionship, or I don't have the ability to get the kind of companionship other people can get through other means. So there's maybe aspects about my body and how I look or how I function that make companionship harder to come by in our world. And so here they're creative in finding ways for companionship. So I think. I just really want to support the people who are honoring their need for connection and honoring their need to give themselves permission to not sit in loneliness. And this is a solution they have found. So that's kind of how I would talk about it.
I really appreciate that. Yeah, because again, it's easier to humanize it when you understand that these people, many of them, are experiencing high levels of loneliness. I think we can all relate to understanding that that's a really hard feeling to feel as a human being, right?
And if you're a man and identify as a man, and you and looking masculine is really important to you, or having certain ways of being masculine are really important to you. Saying I feel alone or I'm lonely doesn't fit the narrative of masculinity.
Yeah.
The biggest stereotype of masculinity is this rugged individualist, this sort of needless man who kind of is functioning in almost all their needs.
Right.
And you don't really associate masculinity with somebody reaching out and saying, I have a need. So there's three things I'm imagining that, four things that I'm imagining are common motivations for this kind of disclosure. And one is it's a place to be vulnerable. Human beings need places to be vulnerable. And here's a new place for people to experiment with being vulnerable. Psychotherapy has been around for quite a long time now, in the last 100 years. And so it's increasingly evolved to be a place where people can be vulnerable. Not everybody can afford it. It's not always available. And I can say to you that the mental health field is a fairly sexually illiterate profession. So just because somebody has a license to be a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a social worker doesn't mean they know how to suspend their judgments about sex and listen to somebody's sexual lives. So, sometimes people I'm going to suggest are going to Jasmin because they're finding a less judgmental and a more suspended judgment space in which to be vulnerable about who they are sexually. The mental health field is not a great place to be vulnerable about who you are sexually. A lot of therapists aren't trained in these conversations and become quite judgmental without even intentionally doing it, but they are. Secondly, I think people are looking for spaces to talk about the sexual shaming parts of their life they've kept a secret. And the way shame is cleansed is that shame has to come out into the light. It has to be spoken, and it has to be spoken in a space that they're not having to be shamed back for speaking of their shame. So there might be men that, have to, maybe they have a turn on that they really enjoy. And they feel ashamed of that turn on. And so they go to a model and they explore these interesting erotic interests, and the model is totally welcoming of them, no judgment. Imagine how healing and important that must be for somebody to have this erotic part of themselves be welcomed and be curious and be interested in, rather than immediately judged or evaluated. This is important. And most people in marriages and couples and relationships, the partners don't know how to receive erotic diversity without judgment. We don't train people in society how to do this. So everybody judges erotic diversity. That's the first thing we do. And we never discuss the judgment that the person's making maybe is not a great thing to do. We just focus on the person whose erotic diversity is being judged. That's the only thing we talk about. Not, why are you judging that person? Shame is a big motivator for this. I talked about that, but secrets and shame. And then the last thing is understanding their erotic selves. My guess is it used to be, when I've been doing this a long time, sexual imagery with photographs used to be the big way people got access to sexual imagery. Then it was, videos, DVDs, VHS tapes before that. And then the internet came along, and now you could have like live interactions to see erotic diversity. People learn about who they are erotically by seeing an image, and their body lights up like it lights up no other time. It's already there. The sexual imagery doesn't manufacture that erotic turn on. The imagery, the interaction, the digital interaction lights up something that's been waiting to be lit up. That's the way our erotic life works. We discover it. We don't manufacture it.
I think that is a really important distinction, is that these are things that are in us.
Yes.
No matter whether they get lit up or not, they're already there. It's basically like they're laying dormant or they're going to be active.
They're waiting to be enjoyed, is the way I call it.
Oh, you're so good with
just
words.
waiting
Where
to
did
be
you
enjoyed.
come from? You're amazing with words. There you go. I'm glad you're writing books. Yeah.
So this is what I believe about why people might be drawn to Jasmin. I think people, without knowing it, without being as articulate as you are drawn towards interactions that suspend judgment. The language I use is very intentional in its attempt to suspend judgment while describing a behavior. And I think we are wired to move towards people who interact that way. Rarely is somebody repelled by some of the ways I've spoken here with you. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It can. Because some people want that judgment. They're disoriented without the judgment. It's like, what do you, no judgment? Oh my God, danger, danger. Some people are wired that way. It's okay. But most of the folks I talk to actually move towards me when I speak this way, not away from me.
And I think it's because the language is, again, like you said, it suspends the judgment, which allows a human being to feel more accepted and safe. It's also very safe language. And again, like it's feeding those root things in us that we really need, but we don't know that we need or how to always articulate it. So when someone's giving it to us and we don't even know exactly what, they're doing on a conscious level, we're very drawn to that.
My goal for men is an additional sentence that goes with the list you just went through. I really enjoy my sources of pleasure, and I have a right to them, and I want to be proud of them. Why can't we be proud of the sources of our pleasure? We're proud of the food we enjoy. We're proud of the meals that are our specialty. We're proud of so many things that give us pleasure. I'm a gardener. I love the pleasure my garden gives me. And I love the pleasure of gardening, the process. And I love when people enjoy my garden, when people walk by and enjoy my flowers that are by the sidewalk, and I watch them enjoy it and find pleasure in what I do. I love that. Well, why can't people be enjoying our sources of pleasure? This is a big ask. But you mentioned that some of the people on Jasmin do negotiate the use of the services of Jasmin within a relationship. It might be a marriage, it might be a long-term relationship, it might be a throuple. I don't. It could be all sorts of things, but nonetheless, they have actively and consciously negotiated this with their partner. That this is part of their, and I'm going to call it possibly part of their solo sex life. This makes their solo sex life fantastic. And it's not partnered sex. We have a separate life of solo sex, separate from our lives with our partner, no matter how long you've been with the partner. We have found through research that one of the highest percentage of people who identify as porn addicts are people who are in high demand religions, who are using sexual imagery online, digitally, or maybe live campsites for their pleasure, and it violates specific expectations of their high demand religion.
Yeah.
And they are in a lot of conflict. Now, they'll call themselves porn addicts, even though they engage in the activity fairly infrequently. It's not about frequency or being out of control. It's the fact that they do this.
Yes.
And when they've measured the distress levels of people with religious conflicts about use of sexual imagery in their body, they feel the same distress, the same levels of distress in their body that people who are using their sexual behavior in a very out of control way. So they're calling themselves porn addicts not because of the behavior is out of control. It's because the distress is so high. It must mean I have an addiction.
What would you say is the first step in helping, or that people can do for themselves to start getting out of their shame and their guilt around
Well, if they have sat through this interview and not turned this off, bravo. Good for you. You have done something that my guess is you've heard something said here, like you. Look at all the people you interview, and you're experiencing something new here. So I would suggest watch this again, and then watch this again, and see what interests you. That I said, or we said in our conversation, one thing that you want to take out into the world. Maybe there's a word you want to start using, sexual imagery instead of porn. That's a favorite of the men I've worked with for all the years. They sit in the group, they love saying sexual imagery rather than porn. The hardest thing of all that I've seen for men to adopt is using the word exploitation. I was exploitive of my partner.
Yeah, people don't.
I used exploitation to solve a problem. Nobody likes saying it. Exploitation is not a nice word. Nobody likes using that word. It is such a hard word to say. So the men I worked with over the years, they worked up to saying the word exploitation. That was not an easy lift, because it's not. Who wants to say the person I love the most in the world, I resorted to exploiting them to solve a problem?
Yeah. I have noticed people do not like that word.
No.
There's a lot of resistance to it because yeah.
Well, it's not who wants to say and notice this part of themselves. Now, this is a blind spot in our American system and our culture, because capitalism isn't exploitive.
Oh,
culture. And we have a history of colonizing in our country where we've exploited, human labor as property for hundreds of years. I mean, heck, we come by exploitation pretty honestly in our country. We do it a lot.
we
And so
do.
it's a blind spot to use that word.
I I really like how you've pointed that out. That must be part of the reason there's so much resistance to it because we're all doing it so much. And so we don't like confronting that part of ourselves.
I say exploitation is the description of a human behavior, not an allegation. Let's make it a human behavior rather than a shameful allegation as the only way we can use that word. It really gets in the way. But that's the heavy lifting. Exploitation's at the far end. The place a lot of people like to start is using the word sexual imagery. They kind of delight in that. And they love watching how people react to it in conversation. What did you just say? What's that? And it creates curiosity rather than offense.
How do we create a more sex positive society?
Well, I'm less enamored with the idea of sex positivity because there's a lot of people who just really need to hold on to their devaluing or not really making sex very important. So we got to include those folks. Sex positivity sort of is a one-sided conversation. I'm more interested in sexual health, but sexual health is for everybody. How do you balance your safety and pleasure? Are you aligning your life with these 6 principles of sexual health? And are you keeping the agreements you have in your relationship? I think those are priorities any human being can focus on without having some sort of, oh, sex is the most wonderful thing in the world. I think that eliminates a lot of people from this discussion because not everybody feels that way about sex. And okay, but are you interested in consent? Are you interested in non-exploitation? I think people can be interested in that even though they're kind of disgusted by most things sexual. It's okay.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you've really opened, I know, my mind, and I'm sure other people's minds will be opened in some area as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I really have enjoyed the conversation with you, Ty. This is part of what I was hoping would happen, that we would find a space to connect in a way that most people don't have these conversations.
Absolutely.
It's so nice to meet you.
You
I
too.
love knowing somebody like you is out there and in this position in the company of Jasmin. You're doing important work, and my guess is it's not something that gets acknowledged enough.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you so much.